everyone. Welcome. See, people are still coming in, which I love to see. Hello, Dawn. Hello, Kirsty. How are you? Welcome, welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Kirsty is coming to us from the UK.
From the South Coast, where it is midnight.
It's midnight, yes. So happy tomorrow to you. Dawn is coming to us from the back rooms of the Frick Art Gallery, Art Museum. We're so happy to have you both. My name is Lisa Viscusi. I'm the manager of adult learning here at the Frick, and we're so happy to have everyone here tonight for this exciting, and I mean exciting, conversation about to take place, filled with our favorite words we've been using are scandal and gossip. So I think it befits the topic, the characters in the stories. So so hold on to your hats. Here we go. Before we go any further, though, I want to read a land acknowledgement. The Frick Pittsburgh occupies ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Osage, and Shawnee peoples. As a place of history and nature, the Frick recognizes the cultural importance of land and the role of cultural institutions in the formation of collective memory. Displacement and erasure are not just histories for Native peoples. Land acknowledgements, like historic sites themselves, are exercises in preservation and reconciliation, engaged with past, present, and future. So just a few logistics before we move forward. You can see that the closed captions are on if you are interested in moving them around the screen. If they're blocking your view of anything, you can hover over them and drag them around your screen to put them somewhere else. You can also disable them if you don't want to see them. You are welcome, please, to leave any comments, questions in the chat, even if it's something logistical, if you need help with anything. Our colleague, Amanda Gillen, hi, Amanda, is back there behind the screens. And here for support. So you can let us know if you have anything that you need help with, or if you have any comments or questions. You're welcome for the transcript. Thank you for thanking us. So I will also say one more thing before I really introduce Dawn and Kirsty, that Giving Tuesday is today. I don't know if everyone knows that, but it is a big day for organizations like the Frick today, and there's a few more hours that you have to help us claim our $15,000, $15,000 for dollar match. And we are very close. It's extremely exciting. We're about $500 away from our goal. So if anyone is interested, you can go to our website or the Give Big Pittsburgh website, I believe, you can search for the Frick. We are there as well. And thank you in advance for anyone who is about to do that, or for anyone who has supported us, or any of our members. You allow us to bring amazing women like Kirsty here, and so many of our other programs and our shows that Dawn has done such a beautiful job on. So we appreciate you, and hope you'll give. So here we have in front of us more amazing women, and we're going to see some tonight in our PowerPoint. But Kirsty, I'm gonna mess it up. It's not Stonell.
It's Stonell.
Stonell Walker. We just had a conversation about this. She is an author and an art historian who specializes in the lives of models. Please correct me if there's any updated information.
Very good.
Author of this beautiful, perfect for a holiday gift book called The Pre-Raphaelite Girl Gang. And she's also the author of Light and Love, a biography of pioneer photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, both published by Unicorn. She is best known as the author of Stunner, The Fall and Rise of Fanny Cornforth, who we are going to be talking about this evening. It's a biography of the most notorious Pre-Raphaelite model. She's also written 2 novels set in the 19th century, and she's the author of the lovely blog, which you must visit, called The Kissed Mouth. And I have not read anything else of yours, but it's on my list. But the Pre-Raphaelite Girl Gang book is funny. It's just, you're learning, you're laughing. It's really, it's illuminating, but it's also like you want more. That's why we're here for this gossip session today, right?
Absolutely.
And all joining Kirsty is Dawn Breen. She is the chief curator at the Frick. She joined the Frick as the assistant curator of decorative arts in 2015 and is again now the chief curator. And she was the curatorial assistant of decorative arts and design at the Carnegie Museum before joining the Frick. So we are in good hands today. And I am going to turn it over to Dawn to start. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you so much, Kirsty, for being here. I'm really so excited for this program. I think we all have your book on our desk right now, or we've all been referencing it this week. And I'm so looking forward to pulling the curtain back on all of these women whose names are so often mentioned in the same breath as the male artists that they're associated with. But as your book reveals, they are real people and they have lives behind them. They are daughters, mothers, wives, lovers, as well as models, muses, and fantasies. So we're going to look at the stories behind these women. So to start, though, I wanted to give everybody just a little bit of context for the exhibition. And if you want to throw it in the chat, I'm really interested to hear from you if you have been to the Frick, if you've seen the show. I'd love to hear what you think of it. I'm going to show a couple of images while I give just a brief overview of the exhibition. I'll show you a couple of gallery images as we make our way through. So this exhibition, Victorian Radicals, the Pre-Raphaelites to the Arts and Crafts Movement, is an incredible look at the very rich visual culture of the United Kingdom. And it follows 3 generations of rebellious artists and designers who are searching for beauty in an age of industry. These artists were looking at the industrial world around them and challenging it and looking to the past for inspiration, and reasserting the value of the handmade, reasserting beauty and soul over the dehumanizing sterility of mass production in 19th century England. To give a little bit of context for the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and then I promise it will be, we'll hear some male names, but we'll focus our stories on the women. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, was an artistic movement started in 1848 by a small band of young male artists who were led by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and William Holman Hunt. And they were idealistic young men fighting against the artistic conventions espoused by the Royal Academy that favored classicist, posed styles of old Renaissance masters, especially Raphael, hence their very creative name, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. They favored intense colors, detail, and the complexity of 14th century art. And they really wanted to represent truth to nature above all. They looked, their subjects looked at biblical subject matter, Shakespearean scenes, mythological, literary characters, often depicted with a very gritty realism and sometimes kind of hyper supernaturalism. They wanted their paintings to feel believable and contemporary. These were pictures of real events with real people, and so they often used their friends as models, posed to express convincing emotions rather than empty theatrical gestures. And they often painted their settings from nature as well. And this exhibition looks at these 3 generations from the Brotherhood into a second generation, a second wave of artists who were inspired by Dante Gabriel Rossetti in particular. And these include Edward Burne-Jones, William Morris, Frederick Sands, this circle of young admirers around Rossetti who challenged the precision and realism of the first generation and would take Pre-Raphaelitism into the aesthetic movement. And the final section of the show looks at the arts and crafts movement, which espoused unity in all of the arts. So we're going to talk about women associated with all 3 of these movements. And our first woman, kind of one of the biggest names within the Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood, is Lizzie Siddel. So she felt like the logical place to start. And I'm going to let Kirsty tell the story of her discovery, which has kind of entered folklore.
Yeah, there's certain stories about Lizzie Siddel that I think everybody knows. And when people think of Pre-Raphaelite women, they do tend to think of Elizabeth Siddel, whether consciously or unconsciously they know who she is. They tend to think of a pale woman with red hair who is slightly doomed, sadly. And so Lizzie Siddel was a milliner. She worked in a hat shop, and she was spotted by a young man called Walter Deverell, whose mother had gone in to buy a hat, and he went, well, she's amazing, look at her hair, it's amazing. But at the time, having red hair was not seen as a particularly desirable thing in Victorian England. Victorian England ideal womanhood would be just like Queen Victoria, which is slightly tall, a little bit plumpish, with little dark hair tied into a little tight bun. And Elizabeth Siddel, with her kind of big mop of beautiful hair, was just not seen as the ideal, but they wanted somebody who was a little different, a little more what they would see as being more kind of natural, more kind of really. And so Walter Deverell got Lizzie to come back and model for him, whilst his sister and his mother were, so it was seen as quite respectable. But then she had to model opposite another artist, which was Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was literally playing the fool in the painting The Twelfth Night, where she was sat there on one side and there's Rossetti dressed as a jester on the other, and Rossetti fell in love with her. And then it was all over for poor Lizzie, I'm afraid. She was Rossetti's muse forevermore after then, poor girl. That's just terrible. But I'm guessing the story that most people know about her is that she posed for Ophelia. But before she posed for Ophelia, she also posed for William Holman Hunt, who was another of the brothers. And here she is as Sylvia in one of his slightly less well-known paintings. But there is Elizabeth Siddel kneeling in the middle. But Ruskin actually didn't like, John Ruskin, who was a very well-known art critic at the time, didn't like the figure of Lizzie Siddel in the middle. He said she looked a bit common. And so yeah, I know, cheers for that. But so she didn't really model for William Holman Hunt again. And so really all that she was left with was to model for the other brothers. And so that's how she ended up in John Everett Millet's bathtub, much to her doom, sadly. Yeah. There she is. Oh, good Lord. So the riverbank is an actual place where you can go and sit on a bench now and you can admire this view without the lady floating, obviously, because the lady floating, Elizabeth Siddel, was posed in a bathtub wearing an old second-hand grey beaded dress that he'd got from a second-hand shop. And she led in the bathtub, and he put little candles underneath the bathtub. And he was so intent in painting, he didn't notice the candles went out, and she got colder and colder, but didn't like to say anything, because either she was very dedicated to art or she was just too polite to go, I'm really cold now. But she caught pneumonia, and we think that is how her addiction to laudanum started, because she was treated for that with laudanum, and laudanum's extremely addictive. And so poor old Lizzie does look, I think when I first saw this, it is almost photorealistic, and you're thinking, well, it's a little bit too close to a lady dying, thank you, when you know that she wasn't at all well when it was being painted. But it is such a realistic painting. It's ridiculous. It's so gorgeous.
Should say, unfortunately, this painting is not in the Victorian Radicals exhibition, but you can see William Holman Hunt's view, although how much of Lizzie Siddel's features remain in what was repainted after Ruskin pointed out her commonness. Again,
exactly.
Thank you, Ruskin. But yeah, both of these paintings have this hyper realistic, I mean, every blade of grass, every leaf, every single detail is delineated in these early.
And they glow as well, because they were painted on a white background. So they put down white first, which was radical. I mean, when you see them, you think they look really, really colourful in books and stuff. But when you see the actual paintings on the wall, you're like, well, that's extremely colourful. Somebody's turned the light up on that one. And it's because they painted on the white background, which just makes such a difference. They glow. They're absolutely beautiful.
They do. They made good use of the new synthetic pigments that were available to them, new modern technology. But even today, I mean, the hot pink of Proteus's pants are shocking to you when you walk into the galleries. I mean, they retain a luminescence. To get back to Lizzie, I mean, you said the relationship with Rossetti would be her downfall. Eventually she didn't model to anyone except him, right?
I know. I mean, it's really difficult because a lot of people have a very harsh view of the relationship between them because they think he exploited her, he abused her. But without Rossetti, she would have remained working in a hat shop. The problem is that the men in the Pre-Raphaelite circle lifted these women out of working classness into a life which they might not have had the opportunity to experience otherwise. And so although she had a bit of a sad life, she got to do amazing art. She got to do art of her own. She got to write poetry. She'd always wanted to write poetry ever since she had, she found a pat of butter at home, and it was wrapped in one of Tennyson's poems, allegedly. And that's how she was sparked to become a poet, after reading this poem that had been wrapped around the butter. But it inspired her to want more from her life and want something that would have been impossible for a working class girl, to aspire to be a great artist. I mean, in 1850s London, that's unthinkable. And yet she did it. And she was exhibited alongside the men in both England and in America. And that's just breathtaking.
Impossible not only for a working girl, but really any woman, because this was a time when women were not allowed to enter the Royal Academy. You couldn't train to be an artist. So I think some people, I want to know what you think, Kirsty. Some people think she had an ulterior motive of modeling for the Brotherhood, that she already had an interest in art and that this was kind of her opening into their world, while other people surmise, that this was an interest that developed after being associated with the group.
I think because of the speed in which she moved from being model to model, artist, poet, I think it's not out of the question that she already knew what she wanted to be, but she would not have been able to. It's very highly unlikely that she'd be able to have accomplished that on her own with the opportunities available to her as a girl working in a hat shop. And so, it's just, unless she took the course of a couple of other of the Pre-Raphaelite models and married well, then maybe, but it's, she didn't have the best start in life, and so she did amazingly with what she was given.
She's showed a lot of talent, and for a life cut relatively short, there's not much of her work that survives, but you can see this artwork by her in the Victorian Radicals exhibition at the Frick, and you can see how tied into the aesthetics of the Brotherhood. She's interested in those kind of elongated forms. I think even within this very simple sketch, like there's an emotion that's delineated in just a few lines here.
She is incredible. And when Ruskin stopped being the patron of John Everett Millais, because John Everett Millais had run off with his wife, Ruskin chose to fund Elizabeth Siddle's career, not Rossetti's, much to Rossetti's temper, I think, but he chose to fund Elizabeth Siddle's career. And I think that's because he saw talent, because not only was she had a good amount of kind of potential, but she also worked very hard. She was very dedicated to what she wanted to do, unlike Rossetti, who was not so hardworking in his art, shall we say. And so I think, yes, she had a great amount of talent there.
Perhaps that contributed to their very turbulent on and off relationship, I guess you could say, to use.
Yeah, I mean,
modern terms.
Absolutely. I mean, people do see her a little bit as a victim, but I think she, from what I've read of her, she gave as good as she got, and she wasn't about to sit around and put up with him, and she took herself off and she studied art on the continent and in other places in England. She was off studying art, and I think it's a shame that her addiction caused her so much trouble, but even with her addiction, she still managed incredible things. But it tends to be now we tend to remember her for her drug addiction and death, which is often put down to suicide, but we don't know. I mean, there's no way of knowing that. It's all I think it's with a lot of the women, it's better to believe the more dramatic story rather than to go, well, she was a woman who fought addiction and produced work, than, she was Rossetti's victim, which I'm not sure. But this painting, which is, it's an incredible picture, and he made many copies. It was a subject he went to over and over again because he was planning a picture of her that looked a little like this before she died, but when she died, his kind of feelings of her being intermingled with that of Beatrice, and he was Dante, and they were destined lovers forevermore. And this is a picture of Beatrice dying, and there she's in the moment of kind of the ecstasy of death, being given the poppy, which is very kind of suggestive of opium. And so he couldn't leave it alone throughout the 1860s. And even this one's 1877, for goodness sake, he made so many copies. But I think he especially worked on like the primary painting of this throughout the 1860s. And I think it kind of culminates in him retrieving his poems from her coffin. So when she died, he was so kind of struck with guilt that he buried his kind of manuscript of poems into her coffin with her. And it's like, oh, I wrote them for her. She should be buried with them. And then after a while, his health wasn't good. His eyesight was failing, and he needed his poems back. Where on earth had he left them? And so unfortunately at that point he had some very nefarious people working for him, especially Charles Augustus Howell, who went, I can get them back for you, that's not a problem. And so dug up poor Lizzie from Highgate and retrieved the poems, and they were filled with wormholes and they had to be disinfected. And the whole experience really kind of pushed Rossetti over the edge mentally, which is just like, for goodness sake, leave the poor woman alone.
Even in death.
Even in death. But after that point, he would not allow himself to be buried at Highgate. It frightened him so much because it affected his mental health so much. He felt that Lizzie would come and get him. And so that's part of the reason he buried many miles away in Kent, where he had actually gone to die. And so, yes, they left him in Kent.
It's a story that goes from, tragedy to sounding like a Halloween farce, but does give you some insight into Rossetti's kind of personal dynamics with the women that he was involved with.
Absolutely.
Also included Annie Miller, and I know you love her as a contrast to Lizzie Siddle's story.
Yes, so Annie also came from a very poor background. She was the daughter of a Chelsea pensioner, and the Chelsea pensioners were in London, down in Chelsea. The Chelsea barracks is not very far from where Rossetti ended up living, actually. And so she was, her mother had died, and so her father had left her with family, and she ended up working at the Cross Keys pub, which is just round the corner from William Holman Hunt's studio. And Holman Hunt set eyes on this beautiful young lady working behind the bar, who he described as flea-ridden and smelling. And so he decided that she was the perfect muse for him. And she is a beautiful young woman, but I can't imagine why the fleas really kind of helped. But they had this kind of idea that they could save a woman and kind of make her into this beauty. And Annie was the prototype for this. And so Holman Hunt gets Annie out the gut and tries to educate her and turn her into the kind of woman he would like to marry. That's very flattering. So, not good enough beforehand. But then Holman Hunt decides he wants to paint biblical pictures, and he has to go to the Holy Land to do that. And so he leaves Annie in London with a list of people that she's allowed to sit for and not allowed to sit for. And she ends up sitting for Rossetti, and you don't really want to leave your girlfriend alone with Rossetti ever. And so Holman Hunt comes back, and he's filled with jealousy, basically, because his other friends wind him up and say, oh, Rossetti's been having it away with Annie Miller. And so, and drawings like this probably don't help, because the fact that there's many pictures of Annie from earlier on, from when Holman Hunt's in the Holy Land, and so Hunt breaks it off with her. And so really the pictures we have from Rossetti are the only ones we have left, because William Holman Hunt scraped Annie's face out of all the other paintings of her because he was so kind of jealous. So when I learnt about Pre-Raphaelite art, when I did my undergraduate degree back in 1992, I was shown this picture and told, oh, that's Annie Miller. And she is, and from like the contemporary description of this painting is, she is rising from the lap of her lover with a look of horror and disgust. And I was like, well, she doesn't really look like, she looks like she's just heard the ice cream van, to be honest with you. She's just like, oh, is it ice cream? And it's because he scraped off the horrible, disgusted thing, mainly because I'm guessing it didn't help sell it. If she's looking completely horrified and awful, you don't really want to look at that in your dining room, do you? So, and he paints on the face of Fanny Wall, who was actually his first wife. And this painting's meant to be hung in a pair with the now what's the name? Oh, the Light of the World. Sorry, the name completely, which is Jesus knocking on the door. And so the idea is that Jesus is knocking the door, and the fallen woman who's there with her gentleman who's keeping her, and she's rising from his lap because she's heard the call of Jesus. So the idea being that the fallen woman would be rising with a look of horror because she is doomed. But it's been changed to the fact that she is rising because she's seen the open window and she knows that she could be free from sin. And but then it doesn't really fit in with the other things, because if you look under the table, there's a cat who's caught a bird. And I think the idea possibly charitably is that the bird can escape through the open window, just as the sinful woman can become all born again and lovely because she's going to let Jesus in, which is lovely.
The fallen woman is a really common trope in the Brotherhood's work.
Yes.
And this is a study in Victorian radicals by Rossetti for another model. Why? What is their fascination with the fallen woman and their fascination with finding those kind of ordinary common women to play that role? It really does. In many ways, the Pre-Raphaelites are completely radical, and they do embrace the idea that women can be more than one thing, that, you know, working class women are worth your notice. But then in the same breath, they produce things that show you women who are fallen and are doomed. So this is a study for a painting called Found. And the woman who has fallen, literally fallen here, is probably Fanny Cornforth. Although I think at one point Annie Miller might have also posed for this as well, because this is a painting that Rossetti starts quite early on, and this is 1853. And so he keeps kind of tinkering with it, and then he meets Fanny Cornforth, who is a woman of which there is an awful lot of rubbish talked about. So what people mainly know about Fanny is this terrible story where he was out walking in the Strand, which was well known for prostitutes, and this woman was cracking walnuts between her teeth and started spitting the shells at him, and he thought this was wonderful, as you would, and said, "Oh, you must model for me because I am so beguiled by your nut spitting." And so he rushes her back and draws her for this painting. But of course that's all complete nonsense, because one, you can't crack a walnut between your teeth, and two, Fanny wasn't up in London working as a prostitute. She had come up to see the fireworks for the return of Florence Nightingale from the Crimea. And she sat in a restaurant with her aunt, and Rossetti comes up behind her and lets her hair down, which he had form for doing. He used to go up to women and kind of grab hold of them on a regular basis, which is very problematic. But he wanted to see how beautiful her long hair was, and goes, "Your hair is amazing. I want to see how beautiful it was. Will you come and model for me?" And I think it's very telling of Fanny. Fanny goes, "All right, then, that's fair enough." And so off she goes and starts modeling, and never leaves his side, basically, for the next 25 years. She's devoted to him, and here she is. And so Bocca Baciata, which means the kissed mouth. And so this is Rossetti's first painting in oils, and kind of marks a massive shift in his art, where he moves from kind of watercolored pictures of Elizabeth Siddel and the maidens and all very virginal and pure, to a woman who, from the poem that's connected to this painting, it means that a woman can be kissed and she renews herself. She doesn't become tainted. And so we have Fanny here with her top undone, and she's got her apple showing that she's tempting, and she's there kissed, basically, and it doesn't mean anything. There's no shame attached to it. And that's kind of what we think about Fanny after a while, by reading that she is there to be, basically, she's there to bring Rossetti peace and pleasure. And for better or worse, that's kind of the role she played in his life. And they remain friends until his death, right?
Yes. Oh, she would not let go. And so Rossetti developed a drug addiction as well later in his life, and she would help him. She would she would go and get him the drugs he needed when he wanted them, but then she would also nurse him when he was ill, and he was ill a lot of the time, and she would put up with him. He wrote the most pitiful letters to her, just basically calling her to come and help him. And she was the only person who'd go and do it. And because he wanted to kind of hide his excesses from his family. They didn't know that Fanny was constantly there in his life, and she resented them because she was told things about them by Rossetti, and Rossetti kind of mixed up everyone's relationships so that at the end of his life, he was taken away and they didn't tell Fanny where he went. And so she had to read of his death in the newspaper. And it is utterly heartbreaking. So she only models for him from about 1856 to 1865 is the last of the big oil paintings. This is a study for the Blue Bower, which is beautiful. It's in the Barber Institute, which is also in Birmingham. It's beautiful blue painting. And then he kind of draws her and does sketches of her in pastel and everything after that point. But she stops being his model and starts basically being his companion and his nurse. Mm-hmm. And she just keeps him going. I mean, without her, I would argue his life would have been a hell of a lot shorter. Mm-hmm. And she just, she's the one we have to thank for the fact that he did all these wonderful paintings in 18 years worth more of life. And so hurrah for Fanny. That's why I love Fanny so much.
She really does epitomize the style that he comes to embrace and is so well known for, and then so influential on artists that follow him in the aesthetic movement. But she is quickly usurped by another woman.
Yes, well, I mean, he knew Jane from earlier, from the late 1850s. Rossetti and a band of his followers, because the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in its kind of core broke up quite quickly. They all went separate ways. They all wanted different things, but Rossetti kind of got acolytes around him. He picked up people like William Morris, and Edward Burne-Jones became his little group then, where he could be the kingpin. And he took them all off to Oxford, where they were doing the murals, which you can still see. They're amazing. You can go to the library. I think it was in the debating rooms, but now they're a beautiful library. And you can go around this very rickety little kind of balcony where you hang on for dear life, but it's completely worth it because you see these beautiful murals, which are still just about there. I mean, they didn't really know what they were doing when they were painting them, so they're a bit worn and a bit splodgy, but it is just still very, very beautiful. But they found the most beautiful woman you'd ever seen in an Oxford theatre, who was Jane Morris. And Jane Morris, again, comes from very, very kind of humble beginnings. Her parents were working class. Her father was a stable hand in Oxford. Jane herself was very tall and had very kind of kinky, frizzy hair, and was not at all just thought of as a beauty in, normally. But then she's elevated by Rossetti and then William Morris into this kind of goddess, and everyone goes, of course she's a goddess. And so then you read description of her being queenly and just wonderful, and I think that is remarkable, because she changed the idea of what was beautiful within her lifetime, and you're like, well, that's just brilliant. Good on you, girl. But she styled herself as well. Again, when Rossetti kind of romanced her for a bit and then ran off, as he was apt to do, William Morris swooped in and painted this very awkward but very beautiful painting of her. And apparently, allegedly, he wrote, "I love you, but I can't paint you," on it. And then awkwardly proposed. And he was wealthy and she was poor, and she obviously thought, well, I could do worse. And so she married him, and he paid for her to take the lessons to become a lady. And she did all that. And she did it in a way that I think she was grateful for the opportunities it then gave her, because she then got to design her own clothes. She did embroider, the most beautiful embroidery. And she got to live a far better life than she would have lived anyway. So well done for her. But after Elizabeth Siddle's death, Rossetti kind of, he is with Fanny, but then he kind of reinserts himself into Jane's life and becomes obsessed with her. And so he does this incredible series of photographs, which he then uses as reference for paintings as well. So yeah, you can definitely see there's some that are absolutely paintings. There's one where she's kind of bending forward, and there's a drawing called Reverie, and she's kind of like in the same pose exactly. But it is lovely seeing the paintings, because you can then see exactly what the colors of her dresses were, because it's difficult in black and white sometimes to work out what color they're wearing. But it's just beautiful.
I always love the quote too. I guess Henry James visited the Morris family and had to hear, about the great beauty of Jane. And he said, it's hard to say whether she's a grand synthesis of all the Pre-Raphaelite pictures ever made, or they a keen analysis of her, whether she's an original or a copy. In either case, she is a wonder.
Indeed. No, she's amazing. And she was, yeah, it's interesting because she's almost unknowable at times. We now have a lot of her letters published, and so you feel you can hear her voice more, because she kept quiet. She was well known for being quite silent in company, and so unlike Fanny, who couldn't stop talking and carping on in her wonderful Cockney accent, and so just people were just horrified when Fanny started talking, and she just offended people left, right and centre by the way she talked. Jane didn't speak, and so I can't imagine Jane's accent was particularly cultured. Even after all the lessons, she still probably had a bit of an accent, but she was quiet, and people just thought she was majestic and queenly rather than common. And so there are loads and loads of paintings of her, and even after she withdrew from the relationship because she was worried about his use of chloral, the drug chloral, and she had 2 young daughters who adored Rossetti, and he was just wonderful, and her daughters May and Jenny just adored him, but she was worried about the influence of his drug taking and everything upon his daughter, so she withdrew from the relationship. But he continued to paint her obsessively and quite claustrophobically. The later the paintings get, the more kind of imposing she is, and she's kind of towering, and they are massive canvases as well. They are big canvases, and some of them are just huge and dark and brooding and quite frightening. And so, but I like this one because he did a lot of Proserpines, as I like to think, and he conflates different kind of Pre-Raphaelite ideals. So she has the long red hair, and of course Jane Morris is very dark hair, but it's kind of like ramming all your Pre-Raphaelite women into one person.
She's like a concoction, like this. And what I love, this is another one that he did a lot of versions of, right? I think he did 7 of these in total, and this is the only one in which the woman has red hair. So it is like an amalgam of all of the beautiful women ever kind of into one type.
Absolutely. I know, it's just he's a funny one, Rossetti, because in some ways he had difficulty finishing work, but then he would repeat a canvas over and over again. And of course, you could argue, well, he's doing it for money if something's popular, but it also seems like he's stuck on an idea, an ideal that he can't get past. He has to revisit.
And I guess we should say too that his former brothers, of course, the Brotherhood had disbanded, I think 5 years after they began in 1853. Yeah. And Holman Hunt in particular was just like flabbergasted at the art that Rossetti was creating, and basically equated it with porn. Thought it was
absolutely
too fleshly, like too much on the body.
Yes, I mean, Holman Hunt was very religious, and he, out of all of them, he's the one who doesn't stray from that truth to nature, white background, very kind of he paints the same art all the way. He's very consistent up until the time he dies. He's producing very consistent work, whereas Millet sells out, basically, in my opinion, and paints things that are popular, and he gets the knighthood and all the money, and so and Rossetti's just inconsistent and slightly drug-addled half the time, and so it's not surprising that they really didn't remain as a band very long.
They were very different. I mean, all it seemed to unite them was this rebellious spirit. And, you know, the earlier themes, the chivalric love and medieval narratives, that's truly what Rossetti is bringing in and bringing into this new spirit. But like you said, overlooked in so much of this is the fact that Jane was a talented embroiderer and dressmaker, and that's a talent that she passed on to her daughters as well.
Absolutely. And she never forgot where she came from. I recently read a letter from her in the papers where there was a case of two seamstresses who couldn't keep up with the amount of work, and they were being sued by the man who was providing them with their piecework, which was pieces of fabric, and they had to sew them together. And they were being sued and pursued, and they were dirt poor, and they could not possibly keep up with the amount of work that would have fed them. And so she intervenes and she pays their fees and basically draws attention to the lot of poor sewing ladies, which was like something that was massively overlooked. And then you do get a flurry of paintings of seamstresses who are basically starving because they can't possibly make ends meet. But it was work that women could do if they had children because they could take it home. But it just was horribly exploited. And I love the fact that Jane gets involved and becomes, as you know, gets politically involved, because her political leanings aren't really known because she kept her mouth shut. But I think that she agreed with her husband's socialist leanings, and that she wanted help for the workers. And she never forgot how to sew. She, you know, continued sewing, and her daughters designed and sewed. And May Morris was an amazing designer, just an incredible designer and writer as well. And so this is the family. I love this photograph so much. So the Morris family and the Burne-Jones family remained very close. So at the back, you have, from the left, we have Burne-Jones's father, and then you have little Margaret, and then her father, Edward Burne-Jones, and Philip in front of them, and then Georgie Burne-Jones. And then you have, and I always get them the wrong way around, but I think that's May Morris, and then William Morris, Jane, and Jenny, who's their other daughter. And they were very close. And this is the back garden of Burne-Jones's house in Fulham in London. And I just think somebody needs to shout cheese, just smile for the camera. But of course, you know, you couldn't hold a smile for that long without your face hurting. But they all look very, very serious and miserable.
They look especially glum. Like there's one thing to hold a calm pose, and
it's been a long day at this point. You can just I think there are other photographs of the children up a tree, and so you're just thinking, oh, they had to get the kids out of a tree in order to just come down from the tree. I need to take you. We just need one photograph. Just I don't care if you don't want to come out.
I do love this because William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones were friends when they met at Oxford. They remained friends for the rest of their life. So this picture is so evocative of that.
Yes. And also they diverged in paths, but they remained friends, unlike the original Pre-Raphaelites who diverged in paths, but really then didn't particularly like each other. I mean, William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones could take the mickey out of each other and were a little bit snippy with each other, but they remained extraordinarily close, and I think died only years apart. They really didn't last. And I think William Morris's death hit the Burne-Jones family very, very hard indeed. And so they were so close.
Burne-Jones is really inspired by Rossetti's practice, and he's the artist who truly, you know, pushes it into aestheticism, where he is thinking about color and tone and escapist kind of fantastical scene. So this is not that hyper naturalism of Ophelia in the river. And he's represented in the Victorian Radicals exhibition by several works, but in particular, this series Pygmalion in the Image. And this is a story that derives from Ovid's Metamorphoses, which was retold by William Morris in his poem, The Earthly Paradise. And this myth tells the story of a young sculptor who is disillusioned with women, dedicates himself to art, and creates a female nude in marble. And you can see in this second image that he is contemplating his creation, but also maybe a little bit troubled by his response to it. There's a little bit of tension in that second image. And then in the third image here, you see the goddess Venus, who takes pity on Pygmalion, and she visits his studio and she turns his sculpture into a real woman. And in the last picture, you see Pygmalion kneeling at her feet. But of course, Victorian convention would never have allowed a man and a nude woman to be making eye contact in a painting. So of course you see her eyes are kind of looking over him, and there's this psychological disconnect that's happening, this fulfilled dream that maybe isn't completely fulfilled. And I can't help but feel like this is a story that has some resonance with his very turbulent affair with Maria Sambaco.
Yes, I mean, the Pygmalion story is one that I think resonates in the Pre-Raphaelite story so often, with the early Pre-Raphaelites trying to make their perfect woman, quite literally mold a woman into this thing. And also one of William Morris's kind of followers, George Bernard Shaw, then writes the play Pygmalion, which becomes My Fair Lady later on. And there are rumors, but I think it's one of those making the facts fit the story afterwards, that George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion is based on the life of Jane Morris, because of course she was made into this perfect woman and taught how to speak and everything, allegedly. But I think that's maybe making the story fit the facts. But I mean, Maria Sambaco is a woman who, as she appears in so much of Burne-Jones' art, that you'd be fooled into thinking that she was one of these women who was created and everything. But no, Maria wasn't having none of that. She was a woman who certainly knew her own mind. She came from a very rich Greek family, and when her father died, she decided she was going to basically emancipate herself off to go and become a sculptor. And so she studied at the Slade, and then she went over to Paris and studied under Rodin, and she became a very, very talented sculptor. But she married Dr. Sambaco, who was big in leprosy, good for him, and had obviously a lot of money that could support her, and they had a couple of kids, but she decided she didn't want to be married to him anymore. So she came back to London, at which point her mother said to Burne-Jones, I'd like you to paint my daughter's portrait, and the rest is slightly awful, tawdry history. And they started having an affair. And the affair she has with Burne-Jones completely overshadows what an insanely brilliant sculptor she is, because her work's beautiful. But it was kind of after all the scandal that erupted from her appalling affair with Burne-Jones, who nobody should have an affair with Burne-Jones. He's rubbish. He's just terrible at having an affair with. He really is. He's terrible. So she tries to get him to run away with her, and he's not having any of that. And so she goes, well, we should then just commit suicide together. It'd be romantic. And he went, no, don't fancy doing that either. And then she tries to throw herself in the Thames, and he ends up rolling around on the pavement with her, trying to wrestle her from committing suicide, allegedly. I have to say allegedly a lot, because this story is told by men after the fact. And so so
you know,
he's not
those hysterical women.
You know what women are like, rolling around on the pavement till the police are called. And so she's basically then denied her place as a brilliant sculptor, because all anyone can think about is the fact that she tried to top herself with Edward Burne-Jones, and he was so terrified that he ran away and couldn't face her ever again. And that's all lies, because he then, after a few years, took the studio next to her, and they continued having their affair. And so it's like, you weren't that scared, obviously. But she appears in so much of his art. So here she is, and she again is a slightly terrifying prospect. There's a lot of Edward Burne-Jones's art where it's women grabbing hold of men who look terrified, which is I particularly like this. So this is Phyllis, and she's been turned into a tree because her frankly rubbish lover had cleared off, and so she turned into a tree, as you do. And then he comes back, and she erupts from the tree and grabs hold of him, and he's slightly startled that he's been grabbed by his tree girl, and he's not looking particularly happy about it. But doesn't she commit suicide after he leaves her and becomes then she's turned into a tree, which yes. I think is just an absolutely heartless depiction to use her as a model for that figure, given yes. the scandalous story that you just told. I know, and she appears over and over again. There's a really one of my favorite paintings because it is so awful, so horrible, is a mermaid dragging a sailor to his death, basically, and he's already dead, and she's dragging him down with this horrible smile, and she looks like Maria Zambeko, and everyone goes, oh no, that's somebody entirely different. It's not, it's Maria Zambeko. He was terrified of her, and I think that was the attraction, because he is the sort of man who mostly enjoyed the company of not little girls in that way, but younger women who I don't think challenged him and were just pretty and kept their mouths shut. And he has an affair with a woman who is the exact opposite of that. And I think he liked being terrified because she was so talented and she was so amazing. But his wife, here we have Georgiana Burne-Jones, who was a very, very clever woman. She was one of a set of sisters, the MacDonald sisters, who basically formed Victorian society, because one of them married Kipling, the architect, and their son was Rudyard Kipling, and one of them married they married a Baldwin, and their son was Stanley Baldwin, who became the Prime Minister, and then she married Burne-Jones, and they just basically formed what we understand as Victorian society with half the things covered there. But Georgiana Burne-Jones, when he married her, she looked like a child. There's a portrait of her when they're engaged, and she looks so very, very young, and they both were very, very young. But when she has the children, she seems to age, and he kind of makes her look older than possibly she is. And so she is very much his loyal kind of memory keeper, though. It's Georgiana who produces this 2-volume memorial of him after he dies. It's kind of this record of his life, leaving out all the bits that make him look a bit rubbish. The affair with Maria Zambeko falls between the 2 volumes, which is very, very classily done there. Georgiana just drawing a veil, not mentioning the other woman in between the 2 volumes. Nice.
This is a painting that you can see in Victorian Radicals. This is a painting that was deemed too scandalous for the 1868 Royal Academy show because, it shows an emotional woman, again, that kind
Good
of
Lord.
fatale Medea concocting a potion to kill the man who left her. But again, this is modeled on an actual woman who Frederick Sands had a relationship with.
Yeah, so we have kind of like the big group of Pre-Raphaelite models people know, but then you have other women. And I was writing Girl Gang, what I wanted to do was go beyond the women that we know to all the other women who have had some research or no research. And Kiyomi, or I had to write down her Kituma, I think, if I'm pronouncing that horribly wrong, was a Romany who lived in Norfolk. And Frederick Sands discovered the camp where she was living and thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. And she's very, very like a Rossetti model, and he was very influenced by Rossetti, and Rossetti actually also uses Kiyomi in one of his paintings as well. And she was fiery and spirited, and she had 4 children with Sands as well. And so whilst he's married to another woman, and she's cited in the divorce paper, which never actually gets done. He never legally divorces his wife, which is very problematic because he has many, many different mistresses and children. But Kiyomi is this, not many awful stories told about her, but there are a couple, like she stoned ravens to death for fun, as you do. And which is like, why? But I think that kind of buys into that kind of gypsy otherness of kind of Romany women being a bit wild and mad and dangerous. And here she's portrayed, she often is portrayed as kind of sorceresses and wild kind of untamed women in his art. And it's all a bit myth making on behalf of him, I think.
Yeah, and the painting that you mentioned that I should say Rossetti, I think, has painted or drawn every woman that we've looked at so far. I think Rossetti is the common thread. 6 degrees of Dante Gabriel Rossetti.
You can't be a woman in Victorian England without Rossetti finding you and drawing you and possibly having an affair with you. So we have Kiyomi is on the right side, and then in the middle is Alexa Wilding. It was meant to be an actress called Marie Ford. Now, there are kind of original sketches for this painting where Marie Ford is in the middle taking her cow down, but it's not. She's now, bless her, she's at the back. You can only see one of her eyes. Poor Marie, because Ellen Smith's been put in front of her. And so then, but behind Alexa on the other side is Fanny Eaton, who is a model of color, which is wonderful because, yay for Fanny, because otherwise it would be all very white. And so it's just wonderful to acknowledge the fact that people of color existed in Victorian London. And Fanny was wonderful. She was born into slavery in Jamaica. Her mother was possibly had her as a result of the person who owned them, which is just awful. But 2 years later, all the slaves are freed. And so her mother can travel and takes her off to London. And Fanny works for a while as a domestic servant and then marries a cabbie called James Eaton at 22, and then proceeds to have 10 children, and that's expensive. So she needs to make more money, bless her. And so she's discovered by, I think it's Simeon Solomon who first draws her. And she's a sensation because she's a beautiful woman of color, and they can go, well, we can make her into our biblical heroines and she can be any exotic woman. You're like, oh, Fanny. But then Fanny's going, well, it's, you know, I'm earning money, for God's sake. I don't mind being biblical today and then exotic tomorrow and then something else the next day, as long as I'm being paid, and this is a good thing. So we have this wonderful woman who crops up in all these different paintings, and it's just amazing. And her children did really well. It is remarkable when you look at the family history and look at them in the census. The children marry well, the children end up living very good lives, and Fanny goes and stays with her daughter when she's 88, and I think she dies when she's living with her daughter. And you just think, well, she must have been so proud that her daughter married a man and they owned a house and they lived a fairly decent life. And you're like, well, good for you, girl. Within your lifetime you move from slavery into practically middle class, which is great.
One thing that I found really interesting in reading about this painting is, you know, some people, I think, want to give it the benefit of the doubt and see it as this celebration of diversity. And while others just see it as evidence of the imperialist white supremacist with the white woman in the center. But one thing that a more maybe pragmatic explanation, sounds terrible, but thinking of artists who were looking for models of color because of the challenge of depicting different skin tones in the way that light plays off of darker skin differently, that it was almost a technical challenge to be able to represent them in that truth to nature
exactly
mantra that they're looking for. And I found it really interesting. This is a sketch by Frederick Sands as a study for the head of Morgan Le Fay, which is a painting in Victorian radicals. And he ultimately doesn't use her, and he uses Kiyomi Gray for the oil painting that's seen. But there are some absolutely beautiful depictions of her, portraits of her. And then, like you said, there are other images where they're just using her exotic features to kind of play in for whatever other culture they're attempting to represent.
I mean, it's especially the painting of the beloved, the bride. It's very tokenistic. It's all very tokenistic. They're beautiful young women. They're wearing a lot of jewelry. They have a little hand servanty boy with his pot of roses, and it's all a bit of a nightmare. But it is depicting. He went out and found the little boy, and he used the little boy in his painting. He didn't attempt to just go, well, that's what a little boy would look like. They do stick to truth to nature, and so we do have depictions of real people, and that, I think, moves the conversation onwards. What we have a difficulty sometimes in this country is acknowledging that people of color existed before the 20th century, when of course they did. They've been here for years. We're all people who've come here at some point, and our connection with the colonies stretches back centuries, and so people came here. And so it's just wonderful to see people. And I've met Fanny's, I'm going to say, great grandson, Brian Eaton, who very much pushes forward research into his famous ancestor. And he's brilliant because he's a gentleman who you wouldn't, he in his own admission doesn't feel like he's an art historian, but he does so much to push Fanny's name into the forefront, as you know, and make her as famous as she should be, because she's remarkable.
And the fact that her name survives and representations of her survive is,
yes, it's just, it is marvelous.
I know we're coming up on 8 o'clock. I'm always famous for going over time. We had two other women. I don't know if we want to go through them quickly, or Lisa's nodding her head.
We can go through them quickly. We can go quickly.
All right.
This is Georgie Gaskin. Georgie Gaskin was a remarkable artist in her own right. What happened was, after about 1880, women could go to art school, and Birmingham had an amazing art school where people like William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, who was from Birmingham, would visit and inspire these young ladies who were kind of middle-class families, and they have to do something before they get married, so they go and get an artistic education. And so Georgie went and got an artistic education, was an amazing artist, and she married her fellow artist, Arthur Gaskin. And so she then becomes pretty much his manager, because they're both massively talented, but he's a bit useless on the managerial business front, and so she manages all of that. But they become Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Gaskin, and she becomes slightly lost in that kind of thing, whereas she was an incredible designer. She's an incredible artist with all different, they use different mediums in the school. They, you know, one week you'd be doing metalwork, one week you'd be doing enameling, and so you get just astonishing pieces out of Birmingham at this time. And so, yeah, I always feel bad for Georgie Gaskin because she's Mrs. Arthur Gaskin, but that's not unusual. At the time, people were known by their husband's name, which is just revolting, but yeah.
And there were a lot of husband and wife artistic partnerships. The Gaskins are only one couple represented in the Victorian Radical show. There's
yes,
also
I was going to say
and Nelson Dawson.
Yeah.
And it seems like a common
yes.
arrangement.
Well, they met at art school, and so you get two for the price of one. You get two massively talented artists in the same family. But of course, when they have children, then the women have to then juggle childcare and raising children with, and so you have to admire the women who keep going and keep pushing their artistic output at the same time, because it would defeat anyone, the amount of work they had to do.
And to think how much had changed since the time of Lizzie Siddel and the 1840s, when women were not encouraged to become artists. That was not a professional pathway that was open to women. And then by the early 1800s, you have the Birmingham Arts and Crafts School, and you have women artists. This is really the time when you start seeing more women artists creating names for themselves, including Kate Elizabeth Bunce, who opens the exhibition.
Oh, she's amazing. I love this picture because I love the fact that she's got dicky eyes. You've got a, and it's one of those where, and there's a photograph of their class, and the girl who sat in front of her, who is also, and I can't remember the poor lass's name, it's Mary something, and her eyes, you can see, it's like, it's her, she's got the funny eyes. And you're going, well, it's truth to nature, there she is, and she's glorious. She's absolutely wonderful. And it's like normalizing the fact that her eyes slightly pose in different directions, and she is wonderful, and I love her. And Kate Bunce didn't marry, and I think that might be part of the reason why she managed to keep working at the scale she did. And she worked with her sister Myra, who produced the frames that go around an awful lot of Kate Bunce's works. And the frames are absolutely incredible because there's little details on the edges of the frames that then appear in the painting. And it's massive amounts of fun to go and try and spot the details that are on the edges in the picture. That's one of my favorite things to do. But yes, the Bunce sisters are amazing.
And I love these paintings. I mean, they're so rich, they're so textural. That arts and crafts idea of the unity of all of the arts. There's not one form of art that's superior to another. You see that in their representations of, I mean, this portrait or this painting has rich textiles. She's wearing a beautiful necklace. She's playing music. Music was so important to this period. There's metal work behind her. There's flowers, there's textiles. It's just amazing. And then to see the full representation, you know, it's not just the painting that's important, it's how it's being presented in that frame as well. And working with her sister. having their names represented is exciting. We could have talked about so many more women in this conversation. I mean, you have a book of 50, and I know you probably could write another book of 50 more.
I could.
But thank you everyone for bearing with us, going a little bit over our time. And if anyone has questions, we're happy to take some. I'm sure that Kirsty would be happy to answer questions about figures that we've talked about, or figures that you think we should have talked about this evening.
There was one question early on about the, you know which painting I'm talking about. Hold on one second.
Whoops.
Was the Proteus and Sylvia painting? The question was, were the men real models as well?
Yes.
Yeah, well, they would have been. I'd have to have a look at the painting, see if I can spot anyone. I think the best painting to try and spot male, because male models weren't as easy to spot in a way, because I don't know why we just aren't as interested in the men, which so I think there might have been also a tendency to get a male model and forget him because you're not about to sleep with him. And so the best painting to spot fellow artists is Millet's Isabella, and they're all down the sides of the table, and you can see Rossetti, you can see William Michael Rossetti, and it's all of his fellow artists. But I'd have to look at the Sylvia and Holman Hunt painting to be able to, but I can't think that I know them. It's terrible. I'm so focused on the women.
You have a lot of details in there, so I can imagine that it's hard not to flip them around. Does anybody have any questions before we say thank you? And Dawn's going to show us. There it is.
There we go. Oh, I don't know. I don't recognize them, but then I am very woman-centric. But yes, undoubtedly they were men. That's undoubtedly. They were people that they knew. They were family. Men. They were men. They were definitely men. They were not ladies in beards.
Definitely
they were
men.
family members and things like that.
I feel like after this conversation, I mean, I've been through the show several times, but there's so many details that because it's so layered, you can go through 10, 20, 30 times and see I see new things every time. And there's a lot of sharing of story and sharing of people, literally,
yes,
and figuratively. But it's when you were talking about Pygmalion, the 4 panels, which is in the show, we talk about it as possibly Jane Burden's story, written by George Bernard Shaw, used by what did you say, Don? The paintings themselves were based on a William Morris Earthly Paradise. There's just so much borrowing, but it's because these stories are powerful and and common.
Yes, that is also half the problem with when you're writing biography of the women, is that the good stories, whether they're true or not, tend to endure because people love the idea that a woman can crack a walnut between her teeth and spit shells at a man, and this somehow entices him. But of course, it's utter nonsense. And the idea that Elizabeth Siddel committed suicide, we don't know that for sure. But it's not such a good story if you go, the poor woman just had made a mistake with her medicine. It's somehow not dramatic, and it doesn't follow the narrative we want to believe that she should follow.
I think one thing that's just so interesting with all of these women, they are in so many ways glorified. I mean, they're fantasies, they're put up on pedestals, literally to be looked at, and then they're diminished in so many ways as well.
Oh yeah. And also it's put in conjunction with each other. And so Rossetti had to have stopped loving one of them because he loved another one, and therefore she must have been jealous of her. And it's exhausting, and it's just, and what worries me is the way we talk about women in the past, I think, reflects how we talk about women now. And so if we talk about women in the past in a certain way, then I think it's a big reflection on how we speak about women now, and we should stop it immediately, because you should always go, allegedly, and also see where the men are feeding the narrative. So the Pygmalion myth. The Pygmalion myth was popular with them because they liked to believe they were creating the most perfect woman. And, good for them. But I think the women might have had a bit of a say occasionally. And
I like to think that, this is very simple, but that these men would not have had their careers had it not been for these women who did suffer and who had, a lack of opportunity. And a lot of, I think you said about someone in particular, but these women who were having affairs with these men, they stayed perhaps in those situations because it gave them stability. And perhaps, I think in one case, I can't remember who, and I'm sorry, it was their Jane, her choice, or I think you said, to sort of join that. Was it Jane?
Yeah. Well, Jane married William Morris, and there's a lot said about the Morris marriage because, of course, Jane then has an emotional affair with Rossetti because Rossetti wasn't physically capable of having a physical affair, but then she has an affair with somebody else later on. But she marries Morris because he's rich, and you can't, rather than being the stable hand's daughter for the rest of your possibly very short life, you could further yourself. All of Fanny, the women in Fanny's family were dead by like 25, 30 at the latest, and Fanny lives till 70 something. And wow, that's just amazing. And just manages to do so much more. She had a bit of a rotten time at times, but she had amazing things. She got to go to Paris, which, dung shufflers' daughters don't tend to go to Paris very often. And so
no, that's probably true. Well, thank you to both of you for really changing the narrative and highlighting these stories of the women who we look at in the show, but it's the men that get talked about and that give the show its title. But it really is the heart and soul and grittiness and all of it is because of these women. So thank you for both of you for sharing your knowledge and your passion for it and your love of hot goss.
My pleasure.
Your love of hot goss. That is what this is about.
Spilling some tea tonight.
Spill some tea tonight. That's right, we did. Thank you again, everyone thank you for staying up with us and for giving us a little extra time, but it's too good. It was too good to stop. So we hope we'll see you in the galleries. And Kirsty, as we've said, you are welcome.
Oh, I'd love to.
Literally any time, day or night, any day of the year, ever. So please come visit us the next time you're in the States.
I certainly will.
We thank you for being with us. Truly, it was a real pleasure and honor. So thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Nancy, in the chat. People are throwing their thank yous at us. So have a lovely night, everyone, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, Kirsty.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Buy the book. Buy all the books. Buy all the books.
Thank you, Lisa.
We'll talk soon, yes? Okay.
Okay. All right, my lovelies.
All right.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Have a lovely night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.